Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you the definitive review of the new Fujinon XF. This is the 16 to 80 millimeter, and if you go through all of the front designations from Fuji, it is the OIS WR. And so that means it has an aperture ring, it means it has image stabilization, and it means that it is weather resistant or weather sealed. Now, to this point, basically, Fuji shooters have had a bifurcated choice if they're going to look for a standard general purpose zoom lens. One is the popular, kit lens, the 18 to 55 millimeter f2.8 to 4 OIS, which I have reviewed previously if you want to take a look at that review. If you want to go to the more premium end of things, they have had a 16 to 55 millimeter f2.8, and that did have the weather resistance and the linear motors, so superior focus. What it didn't have, however, was the optical image stabilization. So you were left with a, kind of a moderately priced and then a premium priced option, but no option that is going to give you kind of some more of the advanced features and the combination of having an optical image stabilizer. Now, I still think that the 16 to 55 f2.8 is the best of these standard zooms if you are a portrait photographer, and you can check out my review of that lens too if you would like to find out why. However, if you are looking for more of a general purpose type lens and you can live with a maximum aperture of f4, the 16 to 80 millimeter kind of gives you a little bit of the best of both worlds. It gives you a weather-sealed body. It gives you excellent optical image stabilization, 6 stops, in fact, as we're going to discover. And beyond that, it also, of course, gives you the linear motor focus and, the kind of premium build and performance that you're looking for. Unfortunately, at least as far as the MSRP goes, it's only $100 more than the 18 to 55 millimeter. Now, to be fair, the kit lens you can often get at a much lower price if you're buying it bundled with a camera, for example, or on sale. It's probably rare that people are paying the full MSRP for it. But, as an apples to apples comparison, at only $100 more at $799, and that puts it at about $300 or $400 less than the 16 to 55. This certainly is going to be an appealing option, particularly since you are getting an amazing focal range from 24 millimeters equivalent all the way up to 120 millimeter equivalent on a full frame configuration, which, as you can see from those photos, is a big range of focus options along the way. Now, if you're looking for a quicker review, that just kind of gives you the highlights, stay tuned. Later on this week, that's going to come. But if you want the nitty-gritty, stay tuned. We're going to jump in, and we're going to start by taking a closer look hands-on at what you're getting in terms of the build and the size. A little bit interesting about the OIS here, there isn't any actual switches on the camera lens or the lens body itself. It's actually rated at 6 stops, and that may not be an exaggeration. This is a 1/3 second exposure here, handheld, and as you can see, while it's a little bit higher ISO because of not having a lot of light, you can see that there is no evidence of motion blur in the frame. And I actually found it very easy to get consistently repeatable results in this regard. It seems to be a function kind of on a smart level where it turns itself off if there's no need for stabilization. Now, it's also R, which means that it has Fuji's kind of hybrid aperture ring, and that there are detents here, so you can manually select aperture and 1/3 stop detents. You can also switch it into automatic mode and allow the camera to operate it or to operate it from the camera, depending on your preference. All 3 of these rings have a different texture feel, which is important because they're not all that far apart. But the zoom ring itself has a nice damping to it. It's nice and smooth. You can see just one inner barrel extends there. Extends a fair bit, but it extends without any kind of wobble. It's a nicely made lens in that regard. Up front, we have a manual focus ring, and so you have to have the camera switched into manual mode. You actually have 2 options for how this is going to function, and so one of those is, and this is all in camera, but you have the option of controlling it in a linear or a non-linear fashion. If you have it in a linear mode, you can see from the on-screen display there's very little focus throw there. There's nothing you feel here because it's focused by wire. So as a result, you don't really feel any kind of limits when you hit either the infinity end or the minimum focus end. And so there's very little degree in between there. And so you can change that to where you can go to a non-linear, but I find that the weight is, as you could see, if you're trying to make a precise focus there, there's very little flexibility to do so. Now you can see that it slows down a bit on the telephoto end, and that is because the depth of field is a little narrower on the telephoto end. So as mentioned, this is a weather sealed lens, and so it has a gasket back here. It has some internal seals as a part of the formula itself. The lens itself, as you can see, is actually quite compact for a lens that is covering this zoom range. Give you an idea of the dimensions, it is 3.08 inches or 78.3 millimeters in diameter, and in its fully retracted, it's only 3.5 inches long or 88.9 millimeters. So that makes it considerably shorter than, say, the 16 to 55 millimeter f2.8, which is 106 millimeters long, so more than 17 millimeters longer. However, it is longer, obviously, than what the 18 to 55 is, which that lens is only 70.4 millimeters. And so it is literally, in terms of the length, it's literally right between those two other lenses. This lens is 15.52 ounces or 440 grams. So that compares to 310 grams for the 18 to 55, but 655 grams for the 16 to 55 f2.8. Now, one advantage to this lens is on the long end, you have the ability to focus down to 35 centimeters, which is actually a little bit longer than either the other two lenses, which can both focus down to 30 centimeters. But because it extends out, to a much longer focal length, 25 millimeters more, you actually get a much higher maximum aperture of 0.25 times, which is obviously a very useful figure. It has 9 rounded aperture blades, which could potentially be an advantage over the 18 to 55, which only has 7 aperture blades, so a little bit more of a circular shape. Now, of course, the disadvantage that it has here is that compared to both of those lenses, at some point in the zoom range, it has a smaller maximum aperture. Now, compared to the 16 to 55, obviously with a fixed aperture of f2.8, that lens is a full stop faster, meaning it'll let in twice as much light as this lens all across the zoom range. Now, since the 18 to 55 is a variable aperture zoom, at some point it is f2.8 on the wide end, so it gives you an advantage. That lens gives you an advantage. Over a fair part of the zoom range, however, it will go to the smallest maximum aperture of f4, and so that will be equivalent to that. So included you have it's fairly unremarkable here, and just a plastic lens hood, tulip shaped, but it does the job. The lens itself feels well constructed, feels good in the hand. So as you can see, mounted on this Fuji X-T3 body, this really is a nice size. It's not as compact, obviously, as the 18 to 55 millimeter. However, it is very nicely balanced and weighted there, and I think that it's a kind of a nice, maybe Goldilocks type size and weight for those of you that are a little put off by the sheer mass of the 16 to 55 millimeter. And the fact, of course, that it's got all of the goodies from Fuji, including the weather resistance and, a nice premium feeling build. I think at the end of the day, it represents a maybe stronger value for money in some ways than the other two options. Now, equally impressive here is the autofocus for the most part here. And so this has gotten Fuji's linear motors, and it, I believe, is a really nice execution of that. It focuses very quickly, very quietly. There is, if you're just shooting stills, there is basically neither any kind of there's no sound, and there's really no lag hardly in focus. It makes focus changes very, very swiftly, particularly those typical, everyday kind of focus changes where you're not going from minimum focus to infinity. In real world, we hardly ever do that. And so for the kind of typical focus changes you're going to make, you probably won't even hardly notice the focus process. It will just pretty much be where you want without any kind of fussing or reservation. So huge kudos to them when it comes to that. Now, first of all, let's take a look for video purposes, and then you can translate some of this to the sound and the smoothness of focus. Let's take a look at how focus pulls are achieved. At wider focal lengths, focus pulls are smooth, quiet, and precise. If we move into telephoto, you can see a little bit more of that stepping that's pretty common with Fuji. The image stabilization is obviously incredibly useful here. It's not, a replacement for a gimbal, but you can see that you are able to handhold pretty effectively, particularly at wider focal lengths. You'll see a little bit more movement even with stability at the telephoto end. Footage off of the lens and through Fuji's excellent 4K looks really good, nice and crisp, good detail, certainly a useful video lens. So good things on that front. As you can see, it's going to be a very nice video lens, I believe. Beyond that also, however, for the most part, my focus accuracy was very good. My only caveat there is that I don't always find, in fact, I never find Fuji's IAF to be quite at the same level of performance as either Sony's or Canon with, after their firmware updates to the EOS R bodies. And so as you're going to see from this series, you can get some misses in portrait situations sometimes, depending upon the relation of the eye to the camera in terms of the angle. Let's take a look. Now, as far as IAF, I had a series of shots done with someone else holding the camera and kind of giving me feedback on this. So we can see that for portraits, it's not as highly detailed. This is not a primo portrait lens. It will work, double for that, but it's not an exceptional lens like, there's some better Fuji options for shooting portraits. But we can see that IAF has focused correctly here. And I just did a variety of, focal lengths here. Again, we can see here, my only criticism that I'll offer of Fuji's IAF technique, or, it's as it stands at this point, is that it does sometimes get a little bit more eyebrow than it does eye. So at 16 millimeters, we can see that we've got a well-focused result, and then jumping in closer to 80 millimeters, same kind of thing. You will notice just a little bit of grabbing in this range where it's closer. I found a little bit more of eyebrow than eye itself, but again, acceptably focused. Now, if you kind of go off center from the camera a bit, you can get some varying results. And so here's kind of case in point. The eyes were not directly looking at the camera, although still very visible. And as you can see, the camera did not properly focus. Same thing happened here. And so obviously, just very poorly focused. Again here, and this is with eyes straight on. And so this, may just be kind of a random thing, but it's not as flawless between the lens and the camera. This was a Fuji X-T3 as what I've seen with, the best IAF systems out there. So a few of those misses were pretty bad. Now, to be fair, I did have a photographer taking those shots that's less experienced than myself. I suspect I could have gotten a little bit better results if I were operating the camera. That being said, however, IAF should take a lot of the guesswork out of the process. And so if we're evaluating the actual performance of the camera and lens combination, as opposed to the skill of the photographer, I think that we can, come away with the conclusion that there's still some work to do there when it comes to IAF performance. By and large, however, for general purpose shooting, my focus results were very good and no major concerns to report there. Now, of course, most interesting is the image quality. And so we're going to jump into a deep dive of the image quality performance across the focal range and in various conditions. Let's take a look. First thing worth noting is that this is obviously a great zoom range. And so on the wide end, we have a 24 millimeter equivalent angle of view. And then on the telephoto end, we have the equivalent of 120 millimeters. And so obviously, again, toggling back and forth, that's a very, very useful focal range that will allow you to cover a lot of photography subjects. Now with Fuji products, it is essentially almost impossible to determine what things look like without correction. There's not really hardly any way to defeat the correction, and so the way that they've engineered is that it just kind of works with that in parallel. So all I can do is show you what it looks like after trying to defeat the corrections. They're still there, but I mean, positive note is that even on the 16mm end, you're going to get nicely corrected results. They do a great job with their profile. And then here on the 80mm end, similarly, there is a nice looking result here. And so whatever vignette and distortion are there, they managed to do a pretty good job of correcting for it. So if we take a look now at 16mm at the actual image quality, we can see wide open that, there's a fair amount of sharpness. Contrast is okay. It's not exceptional here. Moving off here towards the edge of the frame, we can see that there's a difference between this corner of the bill and this corner of the bill. You can see that the drop off is taking place there. And into the corner, it's not a whole lot worse than what we see here. There is some mild degradation. It's not incredibly sharp in the corner, but there is still useful, sharpness right off towards the corner. Stopping down to f5.6 produces a pretty obvious improvement of contrast, and so definitely worth doing there. Looking at the bill here, we can see that contrast is improved, and I think that the sharpness profile extends a little bit further. Here, for example, and moving off into the corner, there is a fairly noticeable difference in contrast and thus crispness of the textures at f5.6. Stopping down to f8 gives us just a little bit more contrast, but not really a significant difference. You're going to get most of the image quality you're going to get at by f5.6 or so. The next mark zone on the dial is 22mm. What we have here is, I would say, a little bit improved contrast at f4. Looking into this zone, you see something similar, that as you move towards the edge, you are starting to lose some of your contrast and resolution. And so there is, it's about 2/3 of the way through the frame, and you start to see a little bit of a drop off. As before, stopping down to f5.6 makes a very noticeable improvement in that corner contrast and resolution, and also even out here into the mid frame. You can see even in these lines, much better contrast and less of that kind of bleeding, a little bit of haze that is there at f5.6. So at around 35mm, we see that we have a fairly similar result in the center of the frame. I do think, again, contrast is a little bit stronger. I also think there is a little bit less of a fall off here into the corner, although what we see here is still that reduced contrast into the corner of the frame. However, not to the degree that we saw at wider focal lengths. We see here an improvement once again, once we've stopped down to f5.6. As before, everything just kind of gets a little bit more crisp and usable. So if you're shooting landscape type shots, stopping down to f5.6, f5.6 to f8 is typically going to give you your best results. So nearer to 50mm now, we see a similar looking type result, and kind of following the similar pattern. It's useful. I mean, and you can see fairly good results here right off to the corner. What we're going to see once again is a bit of a contrast improvement stopping down. So as before, f5.6 produces a noticeable improvement in our contrast ratio here. And so once again, if you've got the light to do it, stopping down to f5.6 is definitely worth it if your goal is to have crisp contrast and resolution right across the frame, because there is an improvement, as you can see, even in the center of the frame. Now at 80mm, unsurprisingly, we find our poorest result. You can see that the resolution and contrast, even in the center of the frame, are only okay, not exceptional at all. You can see there's not a lot of acuity there. And looking as we move off towards the edge, things get worse still, and that's really not a fantastic result there in the corner. Stopping down to f5.6 gives us an improvement in the center of the frame. You can see improved contrast. Here at mid frame, we can see also that there is an improvement. However, it's not as significant as what we saw at other focal lengths. And so even still here at f5.6, it's still fairly soft in the corner of the frame. Stopping on down to f8, f8 does not really give us a whole lot of improvement here. It is only so-so in the corner of the frame. And so that's just kind of the nature of the beast. You do get that extra bit of focal range, but towards the end of it, particularly at the 80mm end, it's just not as sharp as it is across most of the other of the focal range. Here's a shot at 80mm f5.6, and so you can see again that our resolving it's only okay. Anywhere that you look, it doesn't look bad, but neither is it incredibly crisp. In some ways, it does remind me of the kind of lack of acuity of the fine details that I saw with the 18 to 55mm. So as you can see, at a 0.25 times magnification, that's a 1:4 ratio. At minimum focus, I feel pretty good about this end result, and you can see that there is a pretty fair amount of resolving of fine details there, even though 80mm is the weakest part of the focal range, but it does fairly good in this kind of situation. Here's a real-world example, and obviously composing more towards the center of the frame allows you to get a nicer result. So, I mean, this is not macro-type levels of, contrast and resolution, but, I mean, the overall effect, the bokeh looks quite nice, and so it is, I would say, a very usable result. Here's another example here. This is handheld, and while textures are not incredibly crisp here, and I don't see necessarily motion blur, but I mean, it looks useful, and the overall general effect of the image is quite nice near minimum focus. So here at 16mm f5.6, one thing I note is that however it's being corrected, either by optical correction in the lens or via software, we're getting a nice reduction of chromatic aberrations, and so the end result looks quite crisp. You can see once again, as is per typical, that it's not as sharp in the corners of the frame, edges of the frame, as it is, closer to the center. It is a zoom range with a 5 times zoom, ratio, and so that's really to be expected. Now this is around the 30mm focal length, and you can see that we have pretty strong results across the frame. In the middle of the zoom range, it's really delivering good real-world results that renders a lot of detail, and also a very nice color as well. I found that to be a positive. Image like this, shows off that there's good contrast in this image, and and in these transitions in the snow, what this kind of image will show you is that you've got extremes from bright to dark in these snow patterns, and you can see that there's no trace of chromatic aberration that is there. And also, if we look up into the trees at the corner, we're not seeing lateral chromatic aberration there as well. So I'm impressed with that result also. This image here shows, again, very nice contrast and color rendition, and ability to render fine details and without a lot of smudging or blurring at various points in the focal range. Everything basically short of 80mm. Now, one positive that I saw fairly consistently in my review period is flare resistance, particularly for a zoom lens covering a lot of different focal lengths like this. I think that Fuji has done a good job with its coatings and engineering for that. And so as a byproduct of that, not just in stills images like this, or even stopped way down to f22, and so you can have a good look at the sunburst effect here, you can see that really flare resistance is quite good. And if we look at 16mm with it wide open, you can see that there are some very faint ghosting artifacts, but not bad. Even more impressive is that when it's stopped down, they don't get radically different or radically worse. At 80mm, you can see there's a slight bit more flare, either wide open and then here when it's stopped down, but neither one of these results is particularly bad either. And so I give the lens strong marks for flare resistance. One final shot shows, in some kind of a sunset conditions, but shows really beautiful colors. I shot a couple of other lenses at the same time, and this actually produced the nicest color rendition I felt of the 3 different lenses that I shot at the same time. So kudos to Fuji for delivering very nice color performance out of this lens. So for the most part, I think that I have a lot of good there to report. Obviously, there is some degraded performance at the 80mm end of the focal range. That's not entirely surprising, however. It is hard to optimize any kind of zoom lens for peak performance across such a wide zoom range. And typically those lenses that offer the best kind of performance across a zoom range are doing so with a smaller zoom ratio than what you see there. And so outside of that, drop off at 80mm, I do think that we saw fairly good performance with good center performance and, improving edge performance when you stop the lens down. And so I think it falls within the lines of reasonable expectations for a lens like this. Bottom line is you're going to be able to get a lot of great looking images with the lens, with good contrast, obviously good correction for aberrations, very good color rendition, and obviously a focal range that's going to give you a ton of options for getting great photos. And so at the end of the day, I suspect there will be a lot of users that will find that this is their new lens of choice for a general purpose, leave it on the camera kind of lens. Maybe you can pull out more of a specialty lens when you want to do portrait work. I've reviewed a number of portrait type lenses for Fuji, and so some of those are going to be better options for portrait work. But for general purpose shooting, I'm not aware of a better option that has the combination of performance, size, and features and particularly at a price point that I think is reasonable for what you're getting. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll take a look in the description down below, I do have linkage to my full text review, and if you'd like to read up and follow a little more closely there, you're welcome to do so. There's also linkage there to an image gallery if you want to look at photos. Beyond that, there is also a linkage to buying if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, along with linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.